Well, the top cover needs a bit of work. Needs to be cleaned first of all. I'll remove the accessory chute. And on the inside, disconnect the spring from the frame counter, remove that. Remove these two screws here. That hold the glass in the front of the camera. And at this stage, I notice that the viewfinder glass is missing at this end. That glass window is missing, presumably broken, possibly taken to patch up another camera, who would know. So this is all quite dusty. There's a screw missing here that held that bracket in place. That certainly points to someone having purposely undone that screw, probably in the attempt to get that glass out, which may or may not have been broken at the time. I've got to clean this, clean the viewfinder lens, and I've got to find a top for us. I've got to find the dial with the needle, and obviously now I've got to find a piece of glass for that. I'll start cleaning this top down with some naphtha. It's a bit crusty, the deposits here are a little bit crusty. They're probably, there's probably some oxidisation there. I can see that there's pitting in the chrome that's visible there. The top housing's obviously taken a thump at the end there. Well, that certainly goes with the bent over rewind shaft and screw on the top of the rewind knob. It's quite normal for there to be a lot of dirt down at the bottom here where it goes into the trim at the top of the camera body, and that crevice will collect up all manner of dirt. It only needs to collect dust really. If it collects dust, and the dust will hold atmospheric moisture and humidity, and then that promotes corrosion at that point. This is by no means a bad example of a top cover. That looks quite good on the outside, and I'll have to clean the inside. There's a bit of loose dust and grit in here. Particularly at this end near the meter. Well, with that hole open at the top to the environment, it's hardly surprising that a bit of dust got in there. It's anyone's guess how long that camera had been missing its meter dial. That may have been a recent problem, or it may have been like that for years. The camera's certainly got some history to it. I know that the shutter and lens assembly. Well, the shutter and lens assembly certainly came from a later camera, and the lens itself, one of the with the front group's been replaced as well, so it's a bitzer. It's not at all beyond the realms of possibility that this camera was the leftovers, that after somebody had bought a camera in order to get a matched pair of lenses for their other camera, their nicer 3C, that this camera was cobbled together with the leftovers, with the mismatched pair. That would certainly be quite a likely reason for this to be in this state. Unfortunately, people are in the habit of doing exactly that sort of thing, buying a camera, taking the good bits from it for their pride and joy, and then selling the leftovers to an unsuspecting buyer as a going camera. That top cover's looking quite good now. I can certainly see a dent right here. You can catch the light right, you can see that here, just there. You can see there's a little bit of a dent. That's a little bit out of line in that metalwork there. Now that's very hard to straighten out. That brass, once it takes a set, it's very hard to, there's a chip of glass there. That points to that front window having been broken. That's a bit better. It's still got a bit of a wiggle in there, but it's not as bad as it was. Okay, I'm quite pleased with the state of that. I want to clean the viewfinder eyepiece and that meter dial window. I'll start with the viewfinder eyepiece and start with the outside because it's the surface you can see and is usually the dirtiest. And once you've got this clean to your satisfaction, it's easier to deal with the inside glass. Because with one clean surface it's easier to see where the marks are on the other. Yeah, the other inside's really dirty too. The viewfinder on this camera, as I previously mentioned, was incredibly hazy. When you were looking into the light, you could virtually see nothing. That's looking good. Okay, that's great. So the meter needle window there, that needs to be done. I'll clean the outside, which is of course the dirtiest part. Very difficult to clean the dirt out of the corners of that. There's a lot of dirt coming off here. So I'm just using normal domestic glass cleaner for this, nothing fancy. And I'll do the inside surface. The outside surface I'll wipe off. The outside surface I can judge by reflected light how clean I've got that. The inside surface is a bit more difficult, but that looks pretty good. That's a good result. So I can start cleaning up these other bits to put them back. Always start just by cleaning up the metal parts with naphtha. The accessory shoe is in quite good condition. no one has put a flash on there with a hot shoe contact down the middle because the chrome hasn't been rubbed off. These are the two spacers that lift up this component here. And I'll just wipe that off. Get any loose dust off it. Here's our meter window. Get this glass sorted out. Now we've got one piece of glass, of course we need two. So I found an organ donor which is going to furnish us our dial, which is somewhat dirty and sticky at the moment, and it's going to furnish us our piece of glass. So we'll get our piece of glass out first because that's easy. You can see that's no prize either. Two screws hold this dial on here, but I want to remove the dial from that bracket from the top first. And I have a tool made for doing the screws on the rewind knobs. It's the same pin spacing. I can loosen that off. That screw is very, very fragile. It's very easy to shear off. There are no spares really. It's not the same as the ones used on the Retina IIIc or the reflex models. That knob doesn't want to lift off. See if I can encourage that. I might just take this whole piece off first and then fight with that. So there's two screws. Now one of these screws was missing from our subject camera, so I'm pleased to see we've got two for this one, because now it means I've got one spare, because these screws are very hard to find because they're an unusual size. Right, so why will that not come apart? It's coming apart now. Okay. This is all very sticky. I've got to get this clean. Make sure that this pointer moves smoothly with the rack. It's looking good. Clean all the old dried out grease out of the the knob there, and the scale and so forth, of course. So most of that is just more work with naphtha. I'll just work through these pieces one at a time. There is very little chance that this exposure meter will be accurate, but at least it'll go, so it'll look like it should do. Right. And the camera itself should work reliably enough. Handheld exposure meters, they're not as common these days as they used to be, but you can get an app for a smartphone, a light meter app, and they work quite well. So don't discount the possibility of doing that. You can even get free apps that work okay. a lot of dirty dust and dried grease in here. It just makes that knob stiff. Of course, if it's stiff, then when you're applying force on the outside and things don't want to move inside, it'll start twisting the whole bracket on the inside of the camera top cover, loosen the screws, and then when the screws loosen up enough, the whole knob will fall off the camera. That's looking good. This piece. Yeah, a little bit of dried grease and so forth here. That looks good. And the screw that goes in the top, that needs to be clean. That surface was covered in rubbish. That should be okay. I think I can just about put that back on the camera. We'll see which way round this goes, and it goes in that way. Can you see that? Only just. Get one of the screws in place. Now I suggest that you do not go stuffing around with that follower needle or dismantling this from here. Trying to get it correctly positioned again afterwards is very difficult. The response to light for the selenium cell, and therefore the movement of the follower needle as it's designed to follow that response and translate that into useful numbers for you, follows anything but a straight line. So if you start shifting the position of things, you'll find that stuff doesn't do what you'd expect it to do. That's good. I'll just run a little bit synthetic grease around there. That follower needle's moving smoothly. I need the wavy washer. I need the film speed scale. The adjustment for setting your film speed, and then get the screw in. Getting all this seated and the screw in all at the same time is awkward. That's what seems to be working. Let's do that screw up. Don't overdo it. You can shear that screw off very, very easily. Now you can see I've got a smear of my nice fresh grease on that top cover. You don't want that. Alright, so there's our dial and follower needle and so forth all in place. Now I'm going to put a spot of lacquer on those two screws in here. prevent them working loose, because they have a habit of doing that. And because I'm putting lacquer on a part of the camera that you only see if you're servicing the camera, you choose a nice bright colour so that it catches the attention of the serviceman who's next in here, and he realises there's lacquer on that screw, and then he can put a drop of acetone or something on there to soften the lacquer before he tries to get the screws loose. Where you're trying to lock a screw on a camera where it will be visible to the customer, then you would typically use clear lacquer. Okay, well that looks good. What about the shoe? We'll put the shoe on here. These screw heads are a little bit damaged looking. Someone's gone to a lot of trouble to take them off before using a screwdriver that was really too narrow for the slot. But they're not too bad. They'll be okay. Looks acceptable. That leaves us with putting the windows back in place on the front of the camera. And of course we need this screw here. So I better steal that from my designated organ donor. Don't remember seeing a camera missing a screw in that position before. That brings us to cleaning this glass. Excuse me, because that's really filthy. Now, typically, I clean the glass flat on a piece of paper like this, and I'm not too concerned about leaving fingerprints on it at this stage. I'm just getting that baked on grime off the glass. Once I've got it to the stage where it's clean glass with the occasional fingerprint, then I can give it its final clean. But at this stage, this grime is there, wants to be there to stay. Okay, well I've just cleaned those glass windows for a final time. Just using glass cleaner again, and for my cleaning cloth I just use an old well laundered cotton handkerchief is the best, and use that in conjunction with glass cleaner, and you can get the glass nice and clean. I mean, you always end up with cotton fibres all over it, and that's, you can just blow those away. I suppose a microfiber cloth would probably do the job nicely too. So I'm just getting this bracket in place on its little standoffs, getting the screws started, and you can slacken the screws off, and I need to get the glass in place. So always start with the glass at this end, slide that down into place. Pull that frame down away and get this other glass in at the other end here. Let's get that sitting on its tray. That's it. Now holding this forward with my thumb, I can do those two screws up. And there's our viewfinder glass all in the top cover. The only thing left to do now is to fit the return spring for the frame counter. So hook that in there and stretch this out over the arm. Make sure that the hook on that wire is facing towards the top of the camera, not facing into the camera, otherwise it tends to catch the mechanism. Now I'm just checking that the frame counter moves freely. Looks pretty good. It's a bit grimy. I'll have one more go at cleaning that. Some of the marks on that frame counter will almost certainly be corrosion, but a lot of it is just dirt. And a bit of naphtha will clean that up quite well. That looks good. Well, that's our top cover ready to go on the camera body. I better try it out. Right, so let's have a last look in the camera body. I'll just give that viewfinder a last little polish. Certainly had enough handling. There's every likelihood I've left a mark somewhere on it. That looks okay. Everything else is looking pretty. Let's try the top cover. It fits on with only a minimum amount of argument, and I want to check the frame counter to see if the numbers are correctly aligned. They're pretty good. It's just slightly needs to push forward slightly more than that, so I need to slacken the screw off, bring it out one part of a turn, probably be about ideal. Check the top cover's seated correctly. Now that didn't want to return at the end of the stroke. Something's jamming my film advance. Let's try that again. Yeah, it's sticking. It's probably the height of the release lever, I'm thinking. So I'll just reach in there and adjust that down slightly and see what happens. That was it. That's looking good. And the shutter releases nicely. Okay, so I think I can put my screws in the top cover. Of course, we have two chrome screws at this end. One chrome screw on the end of the top cover at this end. That screw actually fixes into the exposure meter housing. Check that everything still moves, everything's good. My rewind knob, well, I've straightened that screw up that was on there. I don't know how well it went. Let's see. It's not coming up all the way, is it? Why not? That's better. That looks a lot better. So our rewind knob is good. And the top of the camera is dealt with. But of course, we haven't finished at the base of the camera. So we're going to put the leatherette back and the surround for the tripod socket and the back catch release cover. Well, starting with the leatherette, I'm just scraping off all the loose bits from the back of that leatherette. As I recall, this was a bit of a fight getting this one off the camera in one piece. That seems fine. Now that little hole there where the screw had come up through it, I don't know, I might choose to do nothing at all about that. I don't think it's worth chasing that. And they have a trim from the advanced knob. So I'm just scraping any excess or loose adhesive from the back of that. That was in pretty good order. And to get everything in place, we need to take off the advance lever. I'm going to wipe the base of that camera down with some naphtha, because with all the grease I've been throwing around, there's every likelihood the grease has got onto that surface. We want it grease free or the adhesive won't work well. That looks good. The leatherette will want the same treatment. I want to remove any grease or oil from the back of the leatherette and any dust that's on that surface, because dust is not a good surface to glue to either. Okay, that's looking good. Glue it back, I suppose. Now this is leatherette, not leather, so it's the substance of the leatherette can be damaged, particularly the finish on the outside, by some adhesives, and for some bizarre reason occasionally it'll be affected by the adhesive on one occasion, and another camera that appears identical we have no problem at all. So to be cautious, make sure that you get your adhesive on sparingly, make sure it covers right to the edges, and working like this, transferring it onto the leatherette with a toothpick is preferable when you're trying to be careful than just splopping it on the leatherette and spreading it out, as I very frequently do. There are sometimes you can push your luck, and sometimes it pays to be more cautious. That's about half the leatherette covered. Let's do this other half. That'll do me nicely. Let's get that adhesive all out of the way. Bring the camera back into the picture and get this leatherette positioned. Now, it's the nature of leatherettes to shrink over time, and that means that they do not want to settle neatly over raised bosses like that. So you may need to run around it to ensure that the leatherette's pressed down firmly. Likewise round that rewind button. Now the leatherette had been raised up slightly there where that screw had come through. See if I can get it to lie down flat. That looks pretty good. Okay, so that's good. And we've got minimal squeeze out, if anything, there in the way of adhesive. Get our advanced lever back on. Screw hole not lining up. There we go. Right, I can put the leatherette patch on there. A little blob of adhesive on my paper. Transfer that to my leatherette patch. Be careful when you're putting the adhesive on a leatherette like this that you're actually putting it on the right surface. I mean, don't laugh. I've seen cameras before where people have put the leatherette on the dress surface instead of on the underside, and of course they tend to look a bit ugly after that. Clean these components up. And get them assembled. Getting this back catch cover and so forth on here is always a bit entertaining. You need to assemble the two main components together. Put this one screw through the slot that's going to have the spring in it. Get your spring in place. Now the spring tension should hold all that together. And while it's holding it all together, you need to get it over the tripod socket and on that cover on the bottom of the camera. Get that screw run down. If you think it's moved and the spring is shifted from the slot, don't tighten the screw up, start again. If the spring gets trapped underneath, it'll get damaged and it won't work properly. There we have it. There's the back catch in place. All our leatherettes are in place. And that's our Retina IIIc camera. it's looking a little bit happier than it did when it came in. Well, not much. It wasn't showing too many awful signs from the outside, but now it's a good functioning camera. With a viewfinder you can see through, rangefinder that works. Couldn't tell whether it worked or not earlier. Focus is nice and smooth. Not that that was a terrible example, but everything's good. Cocks and fires. Shutter goes. Now there was absolutely no danger of the shutter working in the state that arrived in. So there we go. There's our Retina 3C. Somebody's failed repair project. Back together. A good working camera. And this one will go back to its owner. I'm not sure he really needs another Retina 3C, but he couldn't let this one languish in that state. Thanks for watching. Oh, and I forgot to say, the exposure meter is actually fairly accurate. So there you go.